Welcome to the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. We hope you enjoy the following quick take on international affairs while we all wait out the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily Meierding. I'm an assistant professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And thank you for coming and listening to my talk today. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Oil and Gas Disputes, One Less Thing to Worry About. Over the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of discussion about territorial disputes heating up in various regions of the world. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey have been contesting their international maritime boundary. And Turkey has been threatening to send a seismic ship to survey in contested waters. Turkey and Libya have drawn a new boundary. Greece and Egypt have drawn a new boundary. It's been a very contentious situation. Meanwhile, in the East China Sea, Chinese ships have recently entered Japan's claimed territorial waters around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands for the 100th day in a row. Meanwhile, in the South China Sea, China continues to contest sovereignty over islands and maritime claims with other countries, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. And finally, we're seeing traffic increase along the Northern Sea Route in the Arctic. It passes north of Russia and Norway, and as the sea ice retreats because of climate change, we're seeing increasing activity in this region. So, what do all of these cases have in common? Well, all of these contested territories are either known or believed to contain oil or natural gas resources. So then the question is, will countries fight over these resources? Will they fight for oil and natural gas? And my answer to this question is not much, or more specifically, the countries may engage in some minor sparring over oil and natural gas resources, but they won't engage in major international conflicts to get hold of these resources. Really? That seems counterintuitive. That's not what we usually believe about oil and international conflict. Really, I was also surprised, but in the research for my recently published book, depicted here, I found that it's true that countries really do avoid fighting wars to gain control over oil resources. So how did I reach this conclusion? Well, I was looking for a specific kind of conflict, what I call classic oil wars. These are severe militarized conflicts in which countries are fighting largely to gain control over oil or natural gas resources. To look for these conflicts, I looked at a 99-year period, 1912 to 2010. During that period, I identified 180 militarized international conflicts in which countries were contesting territories that were either known or believed to contain oil or natural gas resources. And these conflicts ranged in scope considerably. Some of them were just threats to use military force. Others included the two world wars. These conflicts also included a lot of cases that we conventionally identify as oil wars. So the two United States Gulf Wars, the Iran-Iraq War, World War II, and the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s. My question, looking at each of these cases, was, were countries actually fighting for oil and natural gas resources? And the answer I found was no. During this time period, there were 0 classic oil wars. So what were countries doing instead? What was happening in these 180 conflicts? Well, 159 of them were what I call red herrings. These are cases where countries were fighting in areas with oil or gas, but they weren't fighting for the resources. They were fighting for other reasons. I did identify 19 oil spats. These are minor conflicts in which countries are fighting over oil. So we have the oil goal, but we don't really have the war. These conflicts are mild, they're brief, they're usually non-fatal. They're just not that big a deal in terms of international conflict, especially because they never escalate into larger conflicts. Basically, they flare up and then they're contained. I also found that countries engaged in 5 oil campaigns. These are conflicts that occur in the midst of ongoing wars. Basically, a country is involved in a conflict, its oil needs increase, and it decides to launch a specific campaign in order to acquire oil resources. So this is what we saw with Germany in a couple of its campaigns against the USSR during World War II. And it's also what we see when Japan attacks the Dutch East Indies in the midst of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which had begun 4 years earlier. Finally, I found that there was one historical oil gambit. This was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. In this case, Iraq was attempting to grab Kuwait's oil. But the broader reason for this conflict was Saddam Hussein's fear of the United States. I looked at records from the Iraqi regime, and what I found is that Saddam believed that the United States was driving Iraq's economic crisis by encouraging Kuwait to exceed its OPEC oil production quota. Eventually, he came to see occupying Kuwait as the only way to resist the United States. And he believed that he actually won that war, even though he had to eventually cede control over Kuwait's oil resources. So overall, 159 red herrings, 19 oil spats, 5 oil campaigns, 1 oil gambit, 0 classic oil wars. So why does this happen? We all know that oil in particular is extremely valuable. Countries require it for their economies, especially transportation, and they require it for their militaries. Well, I argue that because we're so focused on oil's value, we overlook the costs of fighting oil wars. And these are really extensive. In my book, I identify 4 types of costs. The first set is invasion costs. In order to grab another country's resources, you've got to invade the territory. And in addition to all of the normal costs of war, invading an oil-rich territory can also be very destructive to the oil industry that the invader wants to seize. Second, if an invader wants to benefit from oil resources over the long term, it has to occupy the country. It cannot take those oil resources, grab them, and go home. Occupation is extremely costly. Third, international aggression tends to provoke a lot of international costs. International oil grabs are regarded as illegitimate acts. They're illegal under international law, and generally the international community is just not in favor of that kind of aggression. In addition, the international community has a pragmatic interest in not having one country consolidate its control over oil and gas resources. So they're likely to resist diplomatically, economically with sanctions, and militarily if necessary. Finally, a lot of countries need international investors in order to develop oil resources. They need their capital, they need their technological expertise, and foreign oil companies really aren't interested in getting involved in occupied territories. It's way too risky. So an aggressor might control new oil, but because it doesn't have investment capital, it can't exploit it. So collectively, based on all 4 of these sets of costs, invasion, occupation, international, and investment, it's just not worth it to fight major conflicts for oil resources. And countries recognize that. So what then is happening in these spats? If countries aren't supposed to fight for oil, then why are they engaging in these minor conflicts? Well, what I found is that most of these spats occur under very particular conditions. Specifically, they usually involve undiscovered resources, they usually involve offshore resources, and they usually take place in contested territories where sovereignty is a little bit ambiguous. So my argument is that it might be worth fighting for oil under these particular circumstances. First of all, because there is no oil industry, invasion costs are lower, there's nothing for you to destroy. Second, because these resources are offshore or near uninhabited islands, there's basically no occupation costs because the local population is not resisting your presence because they don't exist. Third, international costs are a little bit lower because you're fighting over a contested territory, sovereignty is a little bit ambiguous, so it just provokes less international resistance. That being said, the international community still doesn't support the use of force to resolve territorial disputes. So these are only a little lower. Finally, investment costs are actually a lot higher. Because the resources haven't been discovered, you basically have to start from scratch. And oil exploration is incredibly costly. So basically, the takeaway is that countries may be willing to engage in minor conflicts over oil and gas resources under these particular circumstances. Finally, most of the countries that had engaged in these oil spats had already fought over other issues before oil and gas resources entered the picture. Basically, they already didn't get along, and then they continued to not get along over oil and gas. These countries include Greece and Turkey, who've engaged in a number of oil spats, and China and Japan, who also have engaged in oil spats. Nonetheless, even between these countries, between these adversaries with a history of hostility, these conflicts still don't escalate. An oil spat has never become a major international conflict, and I expect that pattern to continue in the future. If anything, as we move forward, we may have even less to worry about when it comes to international oil and gas conflicts. That's because the value of oil and gas resources has gone down. We saw this most dramatically in April when the price of West Texas Intermediate, WTI, a benchmark crude oil, actually plunged into negative territory. Now, this was really unusual. It's a one-shot thing. It happened for only one crude oil for 1 month, probably not going to happen again. But in general, we've seen the value of oil resources decline dramatically since their high point from about 2005 to 2014. They've taken a major hit during COVID-19, and most people anticipate that we will never return to $100 per barrel oil, especially as we go through an energy transition beyond fossil fuels. So oil at this point, it's even less worth fighting for. That being said, we shouldn't be too confident. Countries can still fight in areas with oil, but for other things. Remember, this is what they've mostly been doing for the last century. 159 of my 180 conflicts were red herrings. So countries are still going to fight, but they will continue to not fight over oil or natural gas. So on that note, I've wrapped up my talk. Thank you very much for being here. If you'd like to read more of my writing on energy, I'll pass on some links through the Monterey World Affairs Council. And obviously, you're more than welcome to check out my book. So thank you very much and have a great day.